Today's video is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be a little less focused on building and a little more focused on building plans. And right up front, I have to confess that building plans are not a thing that I'm used to, at least not formal ones. Most of the things that I build come from ideas up here, and so the plans that I have to work with are generally scribbled notes on a piece of paper, or maybe a 3D design that I've done in SketchUp. I do see the value in those plans though. I have made my fair share of mistakes, and if you've seen my previous videos, you know that. Being able to have someone else who's designed something up front and the way that it's supposed to work can definitely save me from some of those mistakes. In addition, it does take a fair bit of time to get the exact measurements correct and to get the material list figured out and just how you're going to cut it out in an efficient way from the materials that you have. So they can be valuable. The question is, are the ones that we're going to review today valuable? Today we're going to look at 4 different plans, each one from a different popular YouTuber who does their builds online and then makes available for purchase plans to do them yourself. Let me introduce you to the players. Up first is Jason Hibbs of Bourbon Moth. I purchased a plan for building a cabinet to hold most, if not all, of the clamps here that will go right here. Each of the plans that we're going to be building in this video are going to be things that will help me in the shop. Next is Jonathan Katz-Moses of Katz-Moses Tools. I purchased a plan from Katz-Moses Tools, which is a portable version of a workbench that can sit on top of an assembly table or a countertop and get clamped down to the surface. Then there's John Malecki of John Malecki Builds. And there's no way that I'm going to keep up that level of intensity. But I did buy his shop shade, so if I'm critical on any of his plans, he'll know that I still had his back, at least in some form. From John Malecki, I bought a plan for a shop cart. And finally, we have Scott Walsh, for whom I admit I do not have a costume. And so I thought instead I would leave you with a corny joke. Why is it that woodworkers do not like drilling holes? Because it's the boring part. From Scott, I have bought 2 woodworking plans for crosscut sleds for the table saw, and I intend to build both of them. So now you've been introduced to all of the players and all of the people to whom I'm going to give my honest reviews, both positive and perhaps critical. Before we can get to building and reviewing these plans, we have to set down the ground rules. I've come up with some categories, and I'm going to evaluate each of the plans according to those categories. First, I will tell you the price that I paid to get each one of these plans. Then I will go over first the purchase experience, then the parts and materials list that are provided in each, the detail level of the instructions. Following that, I'll talk about the accuracy and completeness of the plans themselves, and then I'll provide an overall value score. From each of these scores, together we'll tally up a final grade, and we'll see which plan does the best. I've come up with a few rules as well. First of all, I am not going to go watch the videos. Second, I will not be showing the complete plans. If I show an excerpt from them, it will be because I have very specific feedback on them. I think we're just here to have fun and learn a few things. I know I will. I hope you enjoy watching it too. Let's get started. We'll start with price and the purchase experience. And I will say that overall, the purchase experience was actually quite good across the board. Our first plan is the clamp cabinet, which I bought from Bourbon Moth. I paid $15 for this plan, and it was as simple as entering my payment information, and then there was a link to the file which I downloaded straight to my computer and could open up in a PDF reader. This is the experience I expect, so easy A. Next up is the shop cart plan that I bought from John Malecki. He sells that plan for $5. However, you can buy a set of 3, and you can buy that for $10. So essentially with the bundle, I paid $3.33 and a third. Similar to Bourbon Moth, once I had entered my payment information, I had a link to download the file. I was particularly impressed that it wasn't 3 different files to download. It was just 1 zip file. For that little extra effort, I'm going to give him an A+. The third plan is the micro workbench from Jonathan Katz-Moses. He sells that plan individually for $20. However, you can buy a bundle plan. It has 10 plans in it for $50. So when you do the math on that, the individual cost per plan turns out to be $5. The overall purchase experience here was not quite as good as the other two. After I made my purchase, I was given an email, and that email got a link inside of it that took me to a page where I could download the plans. And unfortunately, it wasn't a single download. Every single file for every single plan had to be downloaded individually, and several of the plans had multiple files, so there was like 15 to 20 links I had to download. Not as good an experience. Still, these are like first world problems. It took me all of 30 seconds to get through all of this. I was just a little annoyed. So I'll give a little ding and take it down to an A-. The final plan is actually two plans from Scott Walsh. I'm going to be building both of them. They're probably going to be the easiest of the builds. You can purchase each of these plans separately for $15. Or he does also offer a bundle of the two together for $25. So in the end, I ended up paying $12.50 for each plan. The purchase experience here was very similar to Katz Moses. In fact, it really looks like they're using the exact same software. I will give this one an A-. And so here are our first round of scores, and really they're all looking pretty good. Things might change a little bit though as we shift over to parts and materials. Okay. Parts and materials. They're an important part of every plan, and because they're so important, I don't think I'm going to be showing them here. What you see here is the materials and parts, minus the plywood, which doesn't fit on the assembly table so well, from the Scott Walsh plan. I do have some feedback on the Scott Walsh plan when it comes to the parts and materials. It's a common thing in these plans, because they're digital, to not only have the parts list, but to include some links to Amazon or other online providers where you can buy each of these parts. Scott did his a little differently. Rather than include the links with the list of the parts at the top of his plan, he put an appendix at the bottom that had links to the items that he had referred to in his parts list. And this was actually pretty annoying. In addition to that, I found that as I was going through the things that he had provided in his parts list, several of them were either not available at all or had some very bad reviews. In many cases, I was not taking the options that he had selected. I was looking for something similar that would still work at about the same size and about the same price. And so I found it actually all quite a bit more work than it really should have been. I think I'm going to give this one a C. But now on to the fun part. Let's build it. Well, okay, the build's all done. We've got both our panel sled and our small crosscut sled. And this is actually kind of interesting. I've never done a crosscut sled that didn't have a front guard. The first thing I want to note though is that I stand behind the C rating that I gave to the parts and materials list. I did use the runners that were specified in the plans for this smaller one, and I agree with the reviewers, I don't like them. There is this adjustment hole up here that you can make in order to make it fit a little tighter or looser inside of your runners on your table saw. There are 4 of them here. I found that one of them wouldn't even fit inside, the other 3 would, and the construction of them just isn't of very high quality. For the panel sled, I used a PowerTech model, one that I found myself. Has a different mechanism for doing that, and I like it a lot better. In addition to that, there were 2 materials that I ended up needing that were specified in the plan but not in the list. The first is a pack of cards, and the second is a set of washers. We needed both of those for spacing according to the plan, and fortunately I had both in my shop. I use these pretty frequently. But it still would have been nice for completeness sake to have it there. Moving on though, detailed instructions is the next category, and here this plan just did excellent. In fact, this may be the gold standard for how you do things. Nearly every instruction that you needed to do had its own diagram and a description of what to do, and it was done in order. All of the parts that were in the parts list were labeled properly in the diagrams. It was super easy to follow. Here's one example of that, just to give you a sense of the detailed instructions that were there. One little nitpick I do have is that on every single page, Scott's name shows up 3 times. And especially I think this watermark that takes up the whole page could possibly be done away with. Our last category is accuracy and completeness. And here it was good, but there were still a couple of problems. Take this for instance. After you build the saw, it gives you some instructions that in order to make the calibration of it just right, you need to follow the 5-cut method. And apparently, in order to do that, I'm supposed to ask somebody named Link. I think it's just an oversight that it wasn't in there. In one of the plans, it doesn't specify calibrating it at all. In the other, it's this unlinked link. But all in all, it was quite easy to get this plan completed. I think I will give it an easy A for its detailed instructions, and I think a B+ in terms of its completeness. Still very high marks, and I thought this plan was easy to follow, and I enjoyed working with it. I'll get to the overall value at the very end, but before then, let's go over to one of the other builds. Okay, our next plan is going to be the micro workbench from Jonathan Katz Moses. And there wasn't a lot to the parts and materials here. I decided to pick this Padauk and this maple, hoping to come up with an interesting pattern. More importantly is this vise. This is not the vise that was in the plan. There was a link just like with Scott Walsh's plans, and just like with Scott Walsh's plans, the vise was not only poorly rated, but it also wasn't available for sale anymore. That is probably a bigger impact on this particular plan because the entire workbench is built around this vise. I tried to get one of a similar size, but there are templates provided for these rods, for instance, and I'm not so sure those templates are going to be applicable. I may have to do quite a bit of adjustment to get this to work. So, while I didn't have the same annoyance of having to jump around in the plans in order to get the materials, I will say that I'm a little bit disappointed that if you're going to sell a plan for money, that you're not doing a bit of a QA pass from time to time to make sure that components, especially ones as critical as this, are still up to date in the plan. So overall, I will give it a slightly higher grade, but still one that indicates that there's some work that needs to be done. I think I'll give this one a B-. With that, let's get to building. One quick note, this particular plan has something that the other plans don't, and that is a paper template. In fact, this paper template spans 2 pages. And what I'm supposed to do here is cut out these 2 things, then tape them together. Hopefully I get the dimensions right. And then I get some quarter-inch stock material, put that on top, trace it out, then I cut out maybe with a bandsaw or something, a rough shape of this, and get that 1/4-inch material to be a nice little template for me to then use on the router table or something else. All of that is great for someone who doesn't have some of the tools that I have, but I have 2 options that are quite a bit better than this. The first one is I could take my shaper, I could set that up if I had an SVG file for this exact same template, and I could cut out either this 1/4-inch thing, or I could actually just cut out the whole thing. The other one is that I have the laser, and I could use the same SVG file, cut out a 1/4-inch material, and use that as my template, rather than have to deal with the error that comes in maybe taping this together. So I'm glad that he has this inside of his plans. I do wish that he also had the vector file that would allow people that have the same tools that I have to get this done a little bit more efficiently. I'm going to go create that vector file right now. Mr. Katz-Moses, if you'd like it, let me know. I'll send it to you. But just a suggestion, it's a good handy thing for many of us woodworkers. Well, here you have it, the micro workbench. And I really do like this build. It's very solid, very sturdy, and I can see myself using it quite a bit. One little follow-up note in the materials list, it did not list a handle for the vise, so I ended up having to go get that. And if you're interested, this is one of the templates I cut out. So let's talk a little bit about the detailed instructions. I thought these were also fantastic. In fact, if I hadn't just done the Scott Walsh plan, I probably would have given this one an A. There are 2 little areas that I think are improvements that Scott did. In several, if not all of the diagrams, it did not refer back to the parts list, even though the parts did have labels for them. That's something that I got in the Scott Walsh plan, and it did make it a little bit confusing sometimes to know which piece I was using with which description. The other one is Scott just had some great iconography inside of his that made it simple to understand, but still, very solid job here. Even though I can't give it an A because I'm grading on a relative scale, I think it's an easy A-. Now for completeness. For the most part, everything in the steps defined exactly what I needed to do. However, there were a few interesting things. There are holes across the top here. They're clearly shown in the plan on the front page. There are no instructions about where to put these holes, what distances or anything like that, what size they ought to be, what considerations you might have for them. I thought that was interesting. There's also no description whatsoever about how to put the vise in place. And since they did include a link to a particular vise, I would have thought that would have been included in the description as well. So in terms of completeness, still a good grade. I was able to put this together following the instructions pretty well, but there were a few things missing, and so I'll put put that one at a B. With that in place, we can move on to our next build, which will be with the John Malecki plan. Our third build is the portable shop cart from John Malecki. You can see the parts and materials here. Doesn't look like much. That's because most of the material is from plywood. In terms of the parts and materials, Malecki made an interesting choice. He did not link to any materials at all. And I'm on the fence about that. Given how poorly those links have worked in some of the previous plans, this might have been a good decision. My ideal case that I set out in the very beginning was that the links were there, they worked, and all the materials and parts were listed properly against them. So I guess I can't give it an A. But from everything I saw there, the materials are exactly correct, and I can figure out the rest on my own. I'll give it the very minimal demerit of an A-. Let's get to building it. Well, here you have it, the rolling workbench, with a few modifications of my own. Some of those modifications are cosmetic to make it match the rest of the wood shop. I'll put the Danish oil finish on in a bit to make it match even more. Part of that is resizing it so that it fit the micro workbench, as if I had a plan going into all of this. And part of it we'll talk about in a minute. But first, let's talk about the drawers. Let's start with the good part. The detail level on these diagrams is fantastic. The exploded views show you how everything fits together, and all the dimensions are very clearly marked. And funny enough, as I was recording this video, Malecki put out a video of his own where he said this.
If you're making plans, label the part so then you can reference the drawing, right?
So well done, John Malecki, since only 2 of the 4 plan providers actually provided this level of detail. So now let's get to the not so great part. The first is that the drawer dimensions themselves fit snugly into the cabinet. Now you can make cabinets without drawer slides, but to do that you have to install other mechanisms to keep the drawers from falling down. And there's no indication of that here anywhere on the plans. The way this diagram is set up, these drawers would just fall over immediately. In fact, the further that I went into this build, the stronger my impression was that whoever put this plan together on paper had never built this cabinet before, and nobody tried afterwards to try and build it from the plan. Across the entire plan there is exactly one detail provided, and it is this one. And it left me scratching my head a little bit too. Okay, if that's how John did it, is this a subtle jab saying that we shouldn't do it this way? Or is this an indication that we should do it this way? In the end, I did not do it this way. I put some backer boards on instead. Then a couple comments about his cut sheet. For one, I was completely confused by the top row. I stared at it for a good long while trying to figure out why there were so many little vertical strips cut out in that top row. And after a while I realized that those are actually the dados. In a cut list like this, those should either be colored marks, not there at all, or dashed lines. And on that same row, why is there a dimension provided on the right, but not one on the left when the 2 sizes are different? Also, where is it that I'm supposed to buy a piece of plywood that has this little bit that sticks out on one side? So for a grade for detailed instructions, there kinda weren't any. And that's an okay choice, but if it's something that you're looking for in your plan, then this is the wrong one for you. I'll give this one a C. And given some of the problems I had with the overall accuracy, I'll give that score a B-. Even with those lower grades, I'm really happy with the product that I ended up with, and I'm glad that I had these plans. So let's move on to our final build. Well, we finally made it to the final build, and this is the Bourbon Moth plan. This is the cabinet for clamps that's going to go at the side of the shop. And let me say, for the parts and materials here, I was very pleasantly surprised. It had links right at the top where all the parts were listed, and they linked to things that were available and fairly well rated. In addition to this wood, there are 3 sheets of plywood that go here. Also, this isn't the wood that was called for necessarily. In some cases, I took some 6-4 wood and I downgraded it to 4-4 wood because I just didn't think it was necessary to have 1-inch thick shelves that are only a few inches in depth. I was very pleasantly surprised with everything that went on here, and I will give this one an A. So let's get to building it. How does he keep this sawdust out of this beard? The fourth and final build is done, and here I am with this nice clamp cabinet. Pretty happy with it. I did make one little change. This caster here was supposed to go in that corner so that as it opened, it would have some support there. My floor is so uneven. I just found it was floating most of the time, so I took it out. I am still working a little bit on the layout. Eventually I'll figure out exactly where all the clamps will go. In the meantime though, let's talk about the detailed instructions. Here's a pretty typical example of the detail that's included in the plan. And if it looks to you like a PowerPoint presentation template, I think it might be. Bullets on the left, pictures on the right. The text descriptions themselves are actually quite good. They're thorough and they cover basically the entire build. It's the diagrams that I had a little trouble with. Unlike the other plans, the ones with text descriptions at least, there isn't a diagram that actually associates with each bullet point. This means that the diagrams themselves don't actually convey all that much useful information to the steps that they're associated with. The plans would definitely be improved by having exploded diagrams that show how each one of the assembly steps fits together. So high marks for the details in the text, but lower ones for the diagram. I will give this grade a B. As I mentioned though, the text was quite thorough. I didn't find any build step that wasn't covered in those text bullet points, and so I have to give that grade an A. All right, let's talk about overall value for each of the plans. And the way I think about overall value is basically to compare the price for purchasing the plan versus the amount of time that I saved by using that plan to create the build. In the case of this particular build from Bourbon Moth, we do have to keep in mind that it was the most expensive of all the plans at $20. It was also missing a few of the features that saved me time in some of the other plans, including the diagrams not having all the dimensions labeled out, clearly exploded views, and the lack of labels back to the parts and materials list. Still, I loved having this. It was a great idea. This is going to give me a lot of utility in the future. I will give that grade a B+. Now, of course, when we're evaluating the Pro Shop cart from John Malecki, we have to keep in mind that it was the least expensive of all of the plans. $5 if you bought it individually, $3 the way that I purchased it in the bundle. And did I get $3 or $5 worth of time savings out of this? Of course I did. The only real problem with it is that due to some of the mistakes that are inside of there, especially with the drawers, it could also cost you quite a bit of time too. That's something a plan shouldn't do. So I'm going to give this one a B+. I really like this micro workbench from Jonathan Katz Moses. And whether I was evaluating that at the $5 bundle price or the $20 individual price, I really think what you get out of that plan is worth it. The only thing that would keep me from giving it the highest mark is the fact that it did not provide any instructions for installing a vise. And I ended up spending quite a bit of time having to figure out exactly what the template was to get this particular vise to fit inside of here, because the one that they recommended was not available. Still, wonderful build. I'm going to give this as close to an A as I can, an A-. Which leads us to the final overall value score. These are the sleds from Scott Walsh, and if you'll remember, there were two different plans. The interesting thing about that is that I would actually give two different scores, one to each of these plans. This panel sled, for instance, isn't all that much different from the way a standard woodworker would make a panel sled. So even though the detail was high, the amount of time savings that were in those details wasn't all that high. This one was very different. There's quite a bit of innovation to this one. It's lightweight, and this handle in the back providing stability, something I wouldn't have thought of, and the detail in putting that all together was very helpful. This one being a lower grade, this one being a little higher, I'll average those out together, and I'll give Scott, in general, a B+. All the scores are in, so it's time to calculate the final grade. And while these final grades make good video content, I think it's much more important that you just look at the individual categories and find the type of plan that best works for your style. Each one of these content creators makes amazing things, and if there's one of their creations that you'd like, I think it's a great thing to go out and support them by buying their plans. Well, I'm exhausted. That was essentially 4 videos worth of builds put into one. And this is something a bit new for me. All my other videos have been focused entirely on building. So drop me a comment and let me know what you think of this sort of content. I wanted to thank all of the providers of the plans, John Malecki, Bourbon Moth, Scott Walsh, Jonathan Katz Moses. I appreciate all the things that they put out on their woodworking channels, and they've been something of an inspiration for me to make some of these videos as well. In our next one, we'll get to some full-time building. I'll see you then.